The phone rang, cutting through the silence of my penthouse office. The caller ID was a number I hadn't seen in 5 years, but one I could never forget. I let it ring 3 times before answering, putting the call on speaker. A frantic, sobbing voice filled the room. It was Sarah, my ex-wife. Alex, please, you have to help me," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "He's gone. Mark left me. He took everything. The accounts are empty. The credit cards are maxed out. He's just gone." I leaned back in my leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. From my window on the 50th floor, the city lights below looked like a galaxy of fallen stars. I listened to her panicked breaths, the raw sound of her world collapsing, and I felt nothing but the cold, quiet satisfaction of a debt finally being called in. For years, I had been the fool, the workhorse, the man whose only purpose was to provide for her and her parasitic new lover. They had laughed at me, stripped me of my dignity, and left me with nothing. Now the roles were reversed. I was the one looking down from the heavens, and she was the one lost in the dark. I took a slow sip of my whiskey before I spoke. My voice was calm, measured, and devoid of any emotion. "Is that so?" I asked. Her sobbing hitched, replaced by a stunned silence. She was expecting the old Alex, the one who would drop everything to fix her problems, the one who always came to the rescue, no matter the cost to himself. But that Alex was dead. He died 5 years ago in a cold, merciless courtroom, buried under a mountain of her lies and her family's betrayal. The man she was speaking to now was a stranger, forged in the fires she had lit. "I don't understand," she whimpered. "Why are you being like this?" You might be wondering why a man would be so cold to the mother of his child. To understand my response, you have to understand the hell they put me through and the price I had to pay for my own salvation. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when Sarah's voice wasn't a source of pain, but the only sound I wanted to hear. We met in college. I was studying engineering, working 2 jobs to pay my way, and she was the art history major who seemed to float through life on a cloud of effortless grace. I fell for her instantly, and I fell hard. To me, she was perfect. I spent every waking moment either working or trying to be the man she deserved. Her family seemed to welcome me with open arms, especially her mother, Eleanor. "You're such a good boy, Alex," she'd say, patting my cheek. "You work so hard. Sarah needs a man like you to take care of her." Looking back, the warning signs were there from the very beginning. Their approval was always conditional, always tied to my performance. When I bought Sarah a promise ring, Eleanor remarked that the diamond was a bit small, but it was a good start. When I graduated and immediately started my own small contracting business, her father clapped me on the back and said, "Good, now you can really start providing for my daughter." I was so desperate for their acceptance that I interpreted their transactional view of me as genuine care. I saw myself as the noble provider, building a kingdom for my queen. I didn't realize I was just the workhorse, expected to pull the family carriage. And then there was Mark. He was introduced as a close family friend, someone who had practically grown up with Sarah. He was everything I wasn't, smooth, charming, and always dressed in expensive clothes despite having no discernible job. He called himself a consultant and an ideas man. He was always at their family dinners, offering me unsolicited advice, telling me I was thinking too small. "A guy with your work ethic, Alex. You should be taking bigger risks," he'd say, flashing a brilliant white smile. "Leverage your assets, that's where the real money is." Sarah would hang on his every word, her eyes gleaming. I saw him as a harmless, if slightly annoying, peacock. I never imagined he was a vulture, patiently circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. After we got married, my business started to take off. The long hours and sleepless nights were paying dividends. I was landing bigger contracts, hiring more guys, and the money was finally starting to flow. But every new success didn't bring relief, it just brought a new level of expectation. The small house we bought was suddenly not big enough. The perfectly good car she drove was now embarrassing. My attempts to reinvest profits back into the company to ensure long-term stability were met with accusations of being cheap. "Alex, you have to spend money to make money," Sarah would parrot, using the exact phrases Mark had used at dinner the week before. "We need to project an image of success." Mark's influence was no longer subtle. He became her constant companion and unofficial financial advisor. He was the one who took her to pick out a new luxury SUV, telling her it was a necessary business expense. He was the one who convinced her we needed to join an expensive country club to network with the right people. And he was the one who came up with the most insidious idea of all. "For tax purposes and liability protection," he explained to us one evening over a ridiculously expensive bottle of wine he'd picked out, "you should put the primary assets in Sarah's name. The house, the holding company for the business. It's the smart way to protect what you're building from any potential lawsuits." I was working myself into the ground, exhausted to my bones. I was a builder, a creator, not a financial strategist. His logic sounded plausible, and Sarah was completely sold on it. Arguing would just lead to another fight, where I was cast as the controlling, untrusting husband. So I agreed. I sat in a lawyer's office and willingly signed over the legal ownership of everything I had bled for. I put the roof over our heads and the company that paid for it all into my wife's name, believing I was protecting my family. I didn't realize I was handing the keys to the kingdom to my own executioners. I was no longer the owner of my life. I was just an employee, and I didn't even know it yet. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I had come home early after a supplier's error shut down one of my sites for the day. The house was empty. I found a piece of mail on the counter that had been accidentally delivered to us instead of a neighbor. Thinking I'd walk it over, I picked it up, and underneath it was another envelope, shoved hastily under a stack of magazines. It was a credit card statement, addressed to both me and Sarah, from a bank I didn't have an account with. My heart started to pound. With trembling hands, I tore it open. The charges were staggering. Thousands of dollars spent at high-end restaurants I'd never been to, weekend trips to boutique hotels, and lavish gifts. It went back months. The final charge was from a custom jeweler for a woman's tennis bracelet. I called the store, my voice hoarse, pretending to be confirming the details of the purchase. The clerk was happy to help. "Yes, Mr. Collins," she said cheerfully. "The engraving was forever my S, all my love, M." It was a punch to the gut, M. Mark. All the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The late nights she said she was with friends, the business trips Mark was on, the constant whispers and shared glances. I wasn't just being overworked, I was being played for a fool. When Sarah got home, I didn't yell. I was unnervingly calm. I laid the statements out on the granite island I had installed with my own 2 hands. She saw them and her face went pale. At first she tried to lie, but the evidence was overwhelming. Then the real Sarah emerged. There were no tears, no remorse. There was only rage. "So what?" she spat. "Did you really expect me to wait around for you forever? You're never home. You're always covered in dirt, too tired to even talk. Mark sees me. He appreciates me." Just then, the front door opened and Mark walked in, not even trying to hide it. He stood next to her, a smirk on his face. They had planned this. When I called her parents, hoping for a shred of sanity, her mother's voice was like ice. "Honestly, Alex, we saw this coming. You smothered her with your work. Mark makes her happy." In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just an affair, it was a coup. They had all conspired to bleed me dry and cast me aside. If the discovery of the affair was a dagger to the heart, the divorce was the slow, methodical twisting of the blade. The trap Mark had engineered was legally flawless. I sat in a cheap lawyer's office, the man looking at me with pity as he explained the grim reality. "You signed the documents, Alex. The holding company is in her name. On paper, you're an employee," she fired, "not the owner." My own signature, my own desire to be a trusting husband had been weaponized against me. I had not only handed them the sword, I had sharpened it for them. In the courtroom, they assassinated my character with chilling precision. Sarah, dressed demurely, played the role of the victim to perfection. She spoke of her deep loneliness, of my obsession with work, and my angry outbursts whenever she tried to talk to me about my emotional distance. My exhaustion was painted as rage. My pleas to stop spending money we didn't have were reframed as financial abuse. Mark sat in the front row, a pillar of quiet support, occasionally nodding in agreement with her lies. He had coached her well. They had an answer for everything, a twisted version of every event that made me look like a monster. The final nail in my coffin was her mother's testimony. Eleanor took the stand, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and told the court how she had watched me transform from a charming young man into a cold and controlling workaholic. She spoke of how she feared for Sarah's happiness and how thankful she was that Mark had been there to support her daughter through such a difficult time. The judge, a man who saw dozens of bitter divorces a week, bought every word. The gavel fell like an executioner's axe. Sarah was awarded everything. The company I had bled for, the house I had built, the savings I had scraped together. To add the ultimate insult to injury, the court ordered me to pay a staggering amount in alimony and child support, based on the income I used to earn from the company I no longer controlled. I was left with nothing but court-ordered debt and the profound humiliation of being utterly and completely defeated. As they left the courtroom, Mark wrapped his arm around Sarah's shoulder and they shared a triumphant smile. I was nothing, a ghost in the life I had built. For a month, I existed in a grey fog. I slept on a friend's couch, the only person who didn't look at me with either pity or contempt. I replayed every lie, every mistake, every moment of my own blindness. The anger and the grief were a physical weight, pinning me down. I could have stayed there. I could have let them win not just the battle, but the war for my soul. But one morning, I saw my reflection in a darkened TV screen, gaunt, hollow-eyed, a ghost. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The pain didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It turned from a crippling weight into a cold, hard diamond of resolve in my gut. They had taken my past. They would not have my future. I packed the few belongings I had left into a duffel bag, took the last couple of $100 from my friend, and bought a one-way bus ticket to a city I'd only ever seen on a map. I needed to be where no one knew my name or the story of my failure. I rented a tiny, single room in a rundown part of town and got a job on a demolition crew. There was a grim irony in it, spending my days tearing down old buildings after my own life had been so thoroughly demolished. The work was brutal, punishing, and anonymous. It was exactly what I needed. It stripped away everything but the ache in my muscles and the grit in my teeth. Every night, while the rest of the city slept, I went to war. I didn't go to bars. I went to the 24-hour university library. I didn't drink to forget. I drank cheap coffee and studied. I consumed books on finance, corporate law, and market strategy. I learned the language of the enemy. I studied the very tactics and legal loopholes that Mark had used to destroy me. I wasn't just a builder of things anymore. I was becoming an architect of systems. I filled notebooks with plans for a new company, a tech-based logistics firm specializing in salvaged materials, a business built on finding value in what others discard as worthless. I had cut off all contact with my old life. As far as Sarah and Mark were concerned, I had simply disappeared. Let them believe I was a broken man who had crawled away to die. They had no idea I was simply gathering my strength, learning to hunt. 5 years passed. For me, Those years were a blur of 18-hour days, fueled by caffeine and an unyielding cold fury. My new company, which I named Phoenix Materials, did not just grow, it exploded. My idea of using predictive analytics to manage salvage and recycling from large-scale demolitions was revolutionary. We turned waste into assets with terrifying efficiency. While competitors were still using brute force and guesswork, we were using algorithms. By the third year, we had cornered the regional market. By the fifth year, my net worth had surpassed anything I had ever dreamed of in my old life. I was no longer Alex the builder, the man with calloused hands and a trusting heart. That man was dead. I was now Mr. Alexander Thorne, the CEO of Phoenix Materials. I lived in a sterile penthouse apartment that overlooked the city, a place of glass and steel with no personal photographs, no clutter, no warmth. Wealth was not a source of joy for me, it was a tool. Power was not for comfort. It was for leverage. My suits were custom-made, my car was a sleek European import, but these were just parts of a uniform, a costume I wore for a role I was now playing. I never once looked up Sarah or Mark online. I didn't need to. Every 6 months, a sterile manila envelope would arrive on my desk from a private investigation firm I had retained. The reports were my only connection to the past, and I read them with the emotional detachment of a general studying enemy troop movements. As I had predicted, they had run my old construction company into the ground within 2 years. Mark was a parasite, not a builder. He knew how to spend money, not how to make it. They sold the company for scraps and had been living off the proceeds ever since, maintaining a facade of wealth that was rapidly crumbling. The last report was particularly interesting. It noted that Mark was now desperately seeking capital for a speculative land development deal. He was over-leveraged, arrogant, and hunting for a big score to save himself. He was a drowning man looking for a lifeline. And I was about to throw him an anchor. Revenge, I had learned, is not a dish best served cold. It is a dish that is meticulously prepared, legally airtight, and served to an enemy who is too greedy to check for poison. My first step was to create a ghost. Using a fraction of my resources, I constructed an intricate web of shell corporations, culminating in a single investment firm I named North Ridge Capital Group. It sounded stable, respectable, and utterly anonymous. It had a professional website, a prestigious mailing address in a different state, and a team of impassive lawyers who knew only that their client was a very wealthy, very private individual who demanded absolute discretion. Through North Ridge, I made my move. I had one of my lawyers contact Mark, not as a potential savior, but as a cautious investor who had heard about his land development project. We played hard to get for a week, then 2. We made him sweat. We made him submit proposal after proposal, feeding his desperation. Then, when he was on the verge of giving up, we pounced. My lawyer called him and said that the board was not only going to fund his project, but was so impressed by his tenacity and vision that they were extending him a multi-million-dollar line of credit for future ventures. We offered him 3 times what he had initially asked for. It was an irresistible bait for a man of his ego. It didn't just solve his problems, it validated his genius. The loan agreement we sent him was a work of art. It was over 200 pages of dense, impenetrable legalese. The first 150 pages were filled with generous terms, low interest rates, and flexible repayment schedules, all the things he would be looking for. But buried deep in the supplemental riders was the clause that mattered. It was a cross-collateralization agreement, stipulating that the loan was secured not just by the assets of the new project, but by all personal assets held by him or his spouse, Sarah Collins. It even listed the specific parcel number of my old house. The contract was a labyrinth, and every path led to my door. My lawyer called me after the signing. "He didn't even read the riders," he said, a note of professional awe in his voice. He was too busy telling me which model of Porsche he was going to buy. The bear had walked into the snare, captivated by the hunk of meat hanging from the trigger. A skilled hunter does not spring the trap the moment the prey steps inside. He lets the animal feel secure, lets it enjoy the bait, lets it believe it is the master of its own destiny. So I waited. For 6 months, I let Mark live in the gilded cage he had built with my money. The private investigator's reports were my window into his world. He bought the Porsche. He took Sarah on a lavish trip to the French Riviera, posting pictures of them smiling on a yacht. He strutted around town like a king, bragging about the powerful and mysterious investment group that was backing him. He was a man who had hit the jackpot, completely oblivious to the fact that the casino was owned by the man he'd robbed. Every dollar he spent was another shovel of dirt on his own grave. The trigger I had set was beautifully simple. Buried deep within the contract was a covenant requiring a full, third-party audited financial review of his holdings to be submitted every 90 days. It was a standard corporate-level due diligence clause that a man like Mark, who ran his life out of a shoebox of receipts, could never fulfill. He missed the first deadline without even knowing it existed. The morning after it passed, my lawyers at Northridge Capital sent a single emotionless letter via courier. It cited his breach of contract and formally activated the loan's acceleration clause. The entire multi-million-dollar principal, along with fees and interest, was due in full. Immediately. The panic was instantaneous. Mark's first call to my lawyers was full of bluster and threats. His second, after speaking with his own stunned attorney, was filled with desperate pleading. There was no recourse. The contract was ironclad. He had no way to pay. He had leveraged everything against a future that would never arrive. Northridge Capital, the ghost I had created, moved with the swift, impersonal grace of a hurricane. The bank accounts were frozen, the Porsche was repossessed, and the final killing blow, the lien was activated against all his personal property, chief among them the house. Faced with total, public, and inescapable ruin, Mark did what every coward does. He packed a bag, drained the last of their joint checking account, and disappeared into the night. He left Sarah alone in that big, empty house to face the consequences of the life he had promised her. And so we returned to the beginning. To the ringing phone and the voice on the other end, choked with the panic I knew was coming. "He's gone, Alex. Mark left me. He took everything." Hearing those words, I felt no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of hatred. I felt only a quiet, profound sense of completion. It was the feeling an engineer has when a complex machine, years in the making, finally hums to life exactly as designed. Her pain wasn't the objective, but it was the calculated, unavoidable outcome. It was the sound of an equation being solved. My life's work, which they had stolen, had become the fuel for their self-destruction. The life they built on my ruins had just collapsed into a sinkhole of their own making. My cold response, "Is that so?" was not born of spontaneous cruelty. It was a final verdict. It was the period at the end of a long and brutal chapter. The old Alex, the foolish, forgiving man who would have rushed to her side to clean up her mess, was gone forever. I had learned the most important lesson of my life. You cannot save people who are committed to pulling you under with them. I hung up the phone, severing the last, frayed thread that connected me to my past. The silence in my office was absolute. But the work wasn't finished. Revenge wasn't just about their ruin, it was about my reclamation. I picked up my phone again and dialed my personal lawyer, a sharp, merciless woman who I paid extremely well for her loyalty and her lack of sentimentality. "Catherine," I said, my voice even and calm. "It's done. File the emergency motion for full custody of my son, effective immediately. The grounds are clear: financial instability, a pending foreclosure, and parental abandonment by her live-in partner. She cannot provide a stable home." I paused, looking out at the city lights. And, Catherine, begin the eviction. Northridge Capital is foreclosing. I want my house back. There was no hesitation in her voice, only the brisk efficiency I paid for. I'll file the paperwork within the hour. The destruction was over. It was time to rebuild my own life on the ground I had just retaken. It took 2 days for the legal notices to hit her like a tidal wave. The emergency custody petition, the official notice of foreclosure from Northridge Capital, the eviction papers. I imagine her standing at her mailbox, watching her world get dismantled one envelope at a time. On the 3rd day, she appeared in the lobby of my corporate headquarters. She looked like a ship that had been dashed against the rocks. Her hair was a mess. Her eyes were wild with sleepless panic, and she was shouting my name at the stoic security guard behind the main desk. I watched her on the security feed from my office, a tiny, frantic figure in a vast marble lobby. I buzzed my assistant. "Send her up," I said. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, she froze. She saw the expanse of glass and steel, the quiet, focused energy of my company, the sheer scale of what I had become. When my assistant showed her into my office, the fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by stunned disbelief. She stared at me, then at the panoramic view of the city behind me, and for a moment she was utterly silent. This reality did not compute with the image she held of me, the broken failure who had crawled away 5 years ago. Then the dam broke, the tears, the pleading, the desperate appeals to a past that no longer existed. "Alex, please," she sobbed, stepping towards my desk. "You can't do this. For our son, think of what we had." I leaned back in my chair, my hands steepled in front of me. "We had nothing, Sarah," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "I had a business and you had a parasite. You were a team and I was the host." Her face hardened, the tears turning to venom. "You did this," she hissed. "This was you, that company, Northridge. It was you all along, wasn't it? You set him up." I gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, I did. You and Mark taught me a very important lesson. The world isn't run by hard work, it's run by leverage and carefully worded contracts. He thought he was a wolf, but he was just a rabid dog chasing a car. I just made sure I was the one driving. You wanted a man who was a killer in business. Well, you got one. You just ended up on the wrong side of the transaction." The comprehension that dawned on her face was my true reward. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't Mark's failure. It was my victory. She had been outmaneuvered, outplanned, and utterly defeated by the man she had discarded. I pressed a button on my desk. "Security will show you out." The court proceedings were a swift and bloodless conclusion. On one side stood Sarah, a woman with no home, no income, and a record of being abandoned by her partner. On the other stood me, a pillar of the business community, with documented financial stability and a clear plan for my son's welfare. The judge's decision was a foregone conclusion. I was granted sole legal and physical custody. Sarah was permitted 1 supervised visit per month, pending the results of a court-ordered psychological evaluation. The same system of justice that had once been used as a weapon to destroy me now served as my shield, its cold logic working entirely in my favor. A week later, the eviction was finalized. I didn't go myself, but I had a private security team oversee the removal of her belongings. Just as I predicted, her parents showed up, their faces contorted with rage. They screamed at the movers, they cursed my name, they tried to block the driveway, but their power was gone. They weren't yelling at their former son-in-law anymore, they were trespassing on the property of a corporation. The security guards calmly called the police, who escorted the sputtering, impotent couple from the premises. It was the pathetic, whimpering end to the arrogance they had wielded for so long. I waited until the house was completely empty and professionally cleaned before I stepped inside. I walked through the silent, echoing rooms. my footsteps clicking on the hardwood floors I had installed myself. The gaudy furniture was gone, the tasteless decor stripped away. All traces of them had been erased. I stood in the living room where my life had fallen apart, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of peace. The house was no longer haunted. It was just a structure of wood and stone again, a blank canvas. It was mine. A few days later, I brought my son home. He was nervous at first, wandering through the vast, empty rooms. He looked up at me, his small voice echoing. "It's so big, Dad." I knelt down, placing my hands on his small shoulders, and looked into his eyes. "Yes, it is," I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "And we get to fill it with whatever we want." Standing there, my son's hand in mine, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't thinking about Sarah or Mark. They were ghosts of a past I had now buried. My victory wasn't in their destruction, but in this, in the quiet promise of a new beginning. The war was over. I was finally free.